Sorry, this table's reserved for real warriors, not social justice warriors.
Mr. Birchum is a brand new adult animated comedy created by comedian and podcaster Adam Carolla for Daily Wire Plus. Originally starting off as a character based on a woodshop teacher he had, Carolla would call into K-Rock FM's morning radio show in the 90s as Dick Birchum, and would later use the character to make prank calls on Comedy Central's Crank Yankers. Now, 30 or so years after its introduction, the shop teacher persona would make its return in the form of Daily Wire's second animated show. And let me tell you, people are loving it. Just look at these glowing reviews.
A tame, unfunny, and poorly realized mess. Flat jokes, monotone voice acting, painfully unfunny Family Guy clone. I'd watch Big Mouth over this, and that's saying something.
Not convinced? Then how about I give you a taste of its razor-sharp humor and biting commentary?
Oh boy, a woke nerd.
And I can't talk about Mr. Birchum without bringing up the art direction. I mean, never before have I seen a show with this level of creativity with its world and characters. I'll be honest, Daily Wire's Mr. Birchum is truly setting a new standard for what— Alright, I'm done. In all seriousness, I will say that the show did surprise me. Going in, I expected the show to be pretty terrible. I mean, judging from the trailer, it wasn't hard to figure that out. But what I didn't expect was for it to fail so miserably in basically every regard you could criticize. The show's main character is incredibly unlikable, all the jokes are about as nuanced as a brick wall, and even if they weren't, they'd still be ruined by its atrocious comedic timing. The art style looks like the same flat, generic garbage of a Netflix show, and the lip-syncing looks like it was done in Go Animate.
Tabata said, "Now me going to kill you."
I could go on about this sad excuse for a comedy for several minutes, but I think this could be a good opportunity to also bring up some excellent animated comedies. For every shortcoming Mr. Birchum has, there are several examples of shows that hit it out of the park when it comes to properly writing likable characters, having jokes that respect your time and intelligence, and having competent animation and an art style that was chosen with intent. So instead of a Mr. Birchum review in the more traditional sense, I'll be using the show as more of a guide as to what not to do in an animated comedy. So let's start with the premise of the show. Mr. Birchum is about a no-nonsense shop teacher and his family as they navigate through modern American culture. Birchum is frustrated with his lazy gamer son, his incompetent students, and now has to deal with Mr. Carponzi, the school's new politically correct DEI officer who's trying to get him fired, all while he tries to maintain some normalcy in his school. Now, I'm of the opinion that with enough skill, you can make any premise for a story work. As a matter of fact, if you squint your eyes enough, you can see some core elements of Mr. Birchum in a different show that some have already drawn comparisons to. In terms of broad strokes, Hank Hill and Richard Birchum are similar people. Both characters are patriotic handymen with a son that they don't understand, a wife who goes out of her way to be seen as a good person, and both characters often have to confront a world that's different to the one that they grew up in. So why is one universally praised and the other unanimously hated? To find that out, let's directly compare a couple of scenes from each show and see if we can spot the difference.
I hand out donkey points when you act stupid, abuse the tools, or I just don't like you.
What if I have to?
Or if you ask dumb questions. Donkey.
Nice sanding, Joseph. Boy, this napkin holder is smooth enough to hold even the finest napkins.
Where's my coffee?
What does getting you coffee teach us about building?
Then I'm less likely to fail your terrible workmanship if I'm properly caffeinated.
You see, this is why we do shop. Not to be more popular or to get into college, but to sand and drill and chisel things for our moms.
So I'm not sure if you noticed, but Birchum comes off as a big old jerk, and Hank Hill is immediately likable. Now, having your main character with either of these traits isn't inherently a good or bad thing, but what needs to be understood is that there has to be a consistency between what the show believes about the character and how the character actually behaves. To demonstrate this, I've picked out 2 episodes from both of these shows that I think represents this idea pretty well, starting with our good example. In King of the Hill Season 4, Episode 4, Little Horrors of Shop, Hank Hill is forced to take a 2-week break off of working at his propane company.
Sloppy? I challenge him to find one single mistake.
Whoa, Hank, just take some time off. See you in 2 weeks.
Wanting to feel useful, Hank volunteers as the substitute shop teacher at Bobby's middle school. After noticing his students' apathy toward woodworking, he goes out of his way to give them projects that they would enjoy building.
Birds can build their own houses. They're called nests. But I've never seen a bird build a boomerang or a dartboard.
Hank remains patient and encouraging as he shows the real-world application of woodshop by not only taking special care to assign projects that they would like working on, but also helping his students fix up the neglected parts of the school. After encouraging his students to bring in tools from home due to being rejected supplies for his class, Hank gets fired from the school to the dismay of his students.
I could fight for reinstatement, but I gotta get back to the propane game on Monday.
Later, when attending the substitute teacher award ceremony for Peggy, Hank gets an enthusiastic ovation from the audience.
Look, it's Mr. Hill.
And it makes sense because Hank earned it. This episode wants you to like Hank and supports it with several scenes of Hank being kind, helpful, and sympathetic. 3 traits that happen to be missing from the other guy. Now that's not to say that Hank Hill is a perfect person. As a matter of fact, he has a fair share of his own flaws. Hank's shown to have a short fuse, his methods of dealing with problems are sometimes a little too antiquated, and he has trouble connecting with his son Bobby due to his bad experience growing up with his own father. King of the Hill recognizes Hank's good and bad qualities, and the story reacts accordingly to both, giving us a flawed but likable character. Man, what a cool guy. Now how about we take a look at how Birchum treats his students? In the pilot episode of Mr. Birchum, this is the first reaction he has to his class.
And the dream died.
Wow, what a miserable wet blanket. We're off to a great start. The very first episode of the show introduces Birchum as an abrasive and cynical woodshop teacher. Throughout the episode, we don't see him have a single positive interaction with any of his students, even going out of his way to punish them for no reason.
P before class, donkey. Also, being named after a pretentious car. Double donkey points.
After he fails his entire class, he gives them an ultimatum.
There is a way. You can still pass my class and get out of the corral. Show up at my house at 0 light 30 this Saturday for a donkey workday. And you can learn some actual building skills.
Now, under the threat of failing shop, Birchum makes his students show up to his house to refinish his deck. Now, I may not be the sharpest bulb in the light bulb shed, but what I do know is that if you want to gain someone's respect and admiration, then threatening them should be pretty low on that list. But apparently in this nonsense world, that seems to do the trick. After the school's disciplinary tribunal threatens to fire Birchum for making his students work during non-school hours, his students individually vouch for him.
But he also taught me how to use a totally sick orbital sander.
Yeah, we actually don't see this in the episode.
El señor Birchum es un buen maestro. Me ha enseñado muchas cosas. Me gustaría que saliera con mi madre.
Birchum gave him a donkey for speaking Spanish in his class. Like, this reaction doesn't make any sense because we never see any good reason for Birchum's class to be on his side. Despite what the show wants you to believe, Birchum remained a big old jerk throughout the length of the episode without any hint of self-awareness, and it's a trait that goes unaddressed throughout the entire show. Because of the superficial similarities you can draw between them, it'd be easy for me to simply call Mr. Birchum a diet king of the hill, but I think that's a little dismissive of how truly awful this show is. I wish I could say that the show's frustratingly arrogant main character is the extent of the show's problems, but unfortunately, Mr. Birchum identifies as a comedy. That's right, we're at the part where I'm going to condescendingly explain jokes. And to do so, I've saved the next section for a show that really captures what it means to be an animated comedy. I'm gonna be honest, despite making its undeniable mark in the pop culture zeitgeist over 3 decades ago, I'm a pretty new fan of The Simpsons. I mean, by the time I was old enough to watch the show, it was already well past its golden age, which many argue to have ended sometime after season 9. Instead, I grew up witnessing the heights and subsequent decline of a different yellow character who's made a similarly massive impact in the world of animated television, but that's a video for another day. After my curiosity got the best of me from watching video essays glaze the show to no end, I decided to check The Simpsons out for myself, and of the several episodes and one movie I've seen, I thought it rocked. The show features your standard dysfunctional family, a trait not uncommon in animated sitcoms these days, but was quite novel at the time of its inception. Following the perspective of the Simpsons family, the show uses its setting to satirize various aspects of American society. It isn't afraid to poke fun at politics, history, places, institutions, and people of all sorts of different beliefs and backgrounds. The Simpsons manages to hilariously explore a wide array of topics, and does so without taking itself too seriously, which is an attitude that I'm starting to appreciate more and more. I'm sorry, give me one sec. What do you want, Nacho? You've been staring at me for like the last 5 minutes. You're hungry? Didn't I just feed you like 20 minutes ago? Well, then you can wait until dinner time. Now what was I just... Oh yeah. Mr. Birchum's comedy takes itself way too seriously. Now this is my first contention with how the show writes comedy. Remember how I mentioned in the previous section the painful lack of self-awareness Birchum had as a character? That's the same level of self-awareness the writers had when coming up with gags for the show. Mr. Birchum, just like any show that's arrogantly dogmatic in its messaging, is what happens when you let ideology be a substitute for quality joke writing. And the consequence is that your show is no longer something to laugh with, but rather to laugh at. In other words, you stop being a comedian and you start being a clown. Of course, that's not to say that jokes can't have an underlying message you want to get across. To tell the truth, this can actually be done quite gracefully. That's why I've chosen The Simpsons as the prime example to properly illustrate how to blend your message into your comedy, and I think an episode that represents that well is Season 7, Episode 5. In The Simpsons Season 7, Episode 5, Lisa the Vegetarian, Lisa decides to give up eating meat for good after gaining newfound empathy and respect toward animals. After making this sudden lifestyle change, this not only causes friction in the Simpson family and serves as the conflict that drives the plot of the episode, but also acts as a premise to write jokes around.
Miss Hoover, I don't think I can dissect an animal. I think it's wrong.
Okay, Lisa. I respect your moral objection.
Throughout the episode, Lisa largely acts as a voice of reason, and the episode agrees with her, having several scenes of Lisa's family and classmates being indifferent toward the cruelty that occurs in mass production of meat products. However, Lisa also acts as sort of a villain in the story. Lisa's moral righteousness compels her to force everyone to comply to her dietary restrictions, which results in her ruining Homer's barbecue. Lisa the Vegetarian manages to point out the cruelty associated with factory farming and meat consumption, while also criticizing Lisa for coercing people into her lifestyle. And both of these messages don't conflict with each other. Rather, they work together to provide a nuanced perspective on a contentious topic, which allows the comedy to not come across as preachy.
Good news, everyone! You don't have to eat meat. I made enough gazpacho for all.
I don't like gazpacho.
What is that anyway? It's tomato soup served ice cold.
Compare that with Mr. Birchum, and it feels like every other joke is just a facade to poorly disguise Adam Carolla's personal hang-ups with a culture war.
Cafeteria is serving surplus canned green beans from the first Iraq war, but the school district has money for this nonsense? What about their allergies? Maybe those theys could be lactose intolerant. This whole place is a stainless steel shrine to millennial mediocrity.
Regardless of whether or not you agree with Mr. Birchum's politics, it's pretty hard to enjoy a lot of the humor when a big part of the show's comedic identity is just blatant lecturing to the audience. On the bright side, there are at least a fair amount of attempts at humor that don't try to rely on ideological pandering. However, these particular jokes aren't immune to my second issue with Mr. Birchum's comedy. On a fundamental level, the joke structure absolutely sucks. And how can I be sure? Well, let's start with the basic mechanics of what a joke is. As far as I'm aware, all jokes are made up of a setup and a punchline. The setup is often used to lead a person to think a particular way, building up an expectation. The punchline is then used to subvert that expectation, and then in theory, that leads to laughter. Pretty basic stuff. With that in mind, let's take a look at a setup and punchline from Mr. Birchum.
Vegan. Dogs are supposed to eat meat. They're descendants of wolves. You ever see a vegan wolf on the Nature Channel?
Alright, there's our setup. I hope the punchline is something clever instead of a cutaway gag to the thing he just described.
I'm a vegan.
Aw, man. Alright, let's watch another one.
What a cheap date. Does he always get this loaded this fast?
Ah, this is nothing. Gage is a pro. He's thrown up on every continent except one.
Alright, that's another setup. I hope the punchline is something clever instead of a cutaway gag to the thing he just described. Can you start to see the problem? Mr. Birchum's jokes will try to have edgy shock humor similar to its contemporaries, but its problem is that you can see the punchline from a mile away. In the examples I've just shown, the punchline was already in the setup, so there's no subversion of the expectation because the expectation had already been met. Now, I'm by no means against shock humor or edgy jokes, but I think it'd be apt to show an effective counterexample of a joke that both properly subverts an audience's expectation and doesn't do so relying on shock humor at all.
Oh, Homer, it's getting late. We'll miss the fireworks.
Marge, we've got all the fireworks we need right here.
Alright, so I know this joke is really stupid, but I thought it was hilarious. And frankly, nothing in Mr. Birchum comes close to being that funny. As a matter of fact, there's nothing in Mr. Birchum that's funny at all. I mean, you'd think there'd be one joke in its combined 2.5-hour runtime that'd make me chuckle, or snort, or chortle, or guffaw, but there's nothing. The entire show is nothing but a sorry attempt to capitalize on the adult animated comedy bandwagon without having the slightest bit of restraint from filling up its bloated runtime with self-aggrandizing lecturing you'd find on Twitter from 2016. And then the jokes that weren't poisoned by culture warp brain rot were boring, predictable, and come across as if my 12-year-old self could have wrote them. From beginning to end, Mr. Birchum as a comedy is truly a miserable experience to watch. Well, that just leaves us with one last section, so let's get right to it. Perhaps the most important question to ask yourself when making an animated comedy is, why make it animated? How does it benefit your show to make it into a cartoon rather than just having it filmed in live action? Of course, there are plenty of excellent shows that uniquely benefit from being animated, but I think there are a few examples that have answered that question quite as well as our final show.
Goodbye, Anne.
Of all the shows I should thank for getting me into learning animation, this one's definitely up there. After airing for 6 seasons over the span of 8 years, with a highly anticipated Season 7 in the works, it's interesting to think that The Amazing World of Gumball came out at the tail end of an identity crisis for Cartoon Network. Around the beginning of the 2010s, shortly after airing several live-action shows that tanked its ratings, Cartoon Network decided that it actually liked having viewers, and ditched the live-action stuff for unique animated shows. Among these new shows were most notably Adventure Time and Regular Show, which started airing within 5 months of each other in 2010, but it wouldn't be until the year after that we would get the third and final show that would take its spot as one of the big 3 of Cartoon Network's renaissance. Being one of the most visually unique shows to ever air on television, it's really no wonder The Amazing World of Gumball had the staying power that it did. While most cartoons usually adhered to a single aesthetic, Gumball would treat practically every character on the show as an invitation to experiment with a new art style. You got hand-drawn animation, 3D animation, claymation, pixel art, whatever this is, and even some real people from time to time. All these different animation techniques and otherwise are seamlessly blended into a single show, giving the character designs a unique charm that you wouldn't see anywhere else. And let me tell you, I have a bit of a passion for character design myself. But if you go from that to Mr. Birchum's art style, the shift of quality almost feels violent. The characters in Mr. Birchum are ugly, low-effort cardboard cutouts that look like if you typed generic animated sitcom into an AI image generator. Just compare Mr. Birchum to nearly every modern adult animated sitcom, and it seems as though they all unanimously agreed to design their characters as ugly and unappealing as possible. All with lifeless eyes, either washed out or garish colors, and with little to no difference in the typically very skinny line weight between them all. With how little effort is put into them, it's almost as if they're embarrassed to be a cartoon. And the problem isn't just the art style either. From the several clips of Mr. Birchum I've already shown, you could probably notice the way the characters move even feels off. When any of the characters move, there's very little anticipation in the movement, which makes them feel like robots. Sometimes they don't even bother to animate certain scenes, so it looks like a slideshow from time to time. When the characters talk, there's usually not enough mouth poses to accurately form words, and even the wrong mouth poses are used for certain words. If you compare that to The Amazing World of Gumball, its animation is just as impressive as its art direction. Of course, it'd be unfair to compare the often action-packed slapstick moments of Gumball to the more or less realistic approach Mr. Birchum took, but even just looking at the small moments, you can see that the anticipation before an action is very clear, it utilizes some subtle squash and stretch to to give the illusion of weight and gravity and is able to convey impact in just a few frames of animation. And obviously, I know it's still not the most fair comparison, given that Gumball has a much bigger budget and team working on the show, but even the facets of animation that aren't necessarily reliant on those variables are better. Going back to animating mouth movement, it's not hard to make a half-decent lip sync if you know what you're doing. If you make enough mouth poses and don't haphazardly throw them together, you can convey the illusion of talking rather effectively without an extraordinary amount of time and effort. With all that being said, it seems as though the amazing world of Gumball had a blast with its visual presence, whereas the way Mr. Birchum was drawn and animated comes across as though it was a bothersome chore to get over with. And I mean personally, I think that's a good way to describe the entirety of this train wreck of a show. Whether it's the poor character writing, the boring preachy comedy, or its insultingly lazy art style, Mr. Birchum manages to fall flat on its face when it comes to the fundamentals of making an animated comedy. But I think the worst part of it all is that it didn't have to be that way. The premise of an old-school, working-class father who advocates for traditional values isn't in itself a bad idea. Heck, they made a beloved show out of it. And to be honest, despite how much I despise the way a lot of modern animated comedies look, it isn't necessarily the nail in the coffin when making a show. Honestly, I think there's really only one truly meaningful change that would save a show like Mr. Birchum, and believe it or not, that change can be found in Mr. Birchum 30 years ago. In the beginning of the video, I mentioned that Mr. Birchum originally started off as a character that Adam Carolla would play on K-Rock FM's morning radio show in the 90s. What I didn't mention, however, is that Mr. Birchum back then was a little different to the one we know today.
Well, what's going on?
Well, I'm calling from home today. You know, I got about 3 days off. I got unpaid leave. I was suspended for 3 days. I won't be back till Friday.
What happened?
Well, basically I'm being punished because I try too hard. You know, I care too much. Well, what happened was a couple of things. Friday, I wrestled away what looked to me like a Pez dispenser from a Hungarian foreign exchange student named Gabi.
Right.
Anyway, you know, using the old he didn't bring enough for the class threat. Anyway, it wasn't until well after a seizure I realized it was an asthma inhaler.
See, now that's bad. That's a lawsuit, all right.
In the comments section of this particular video, you can find a comment that I think hits the nail on the head as to what Mr. Birchum lost. There seems to be a disconnect with this and the Daily Wire Birchum in that in the Daily Wire one, we were supposed to and failed to laugh with him, and in this, we were supposed to laugh at him. Poor grammar aside, Kevin's got a point. From the very beginning, the character of Mr. Birchum was the butt of the joke, or at least he used to be. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Adam Carolla originally made Mr. Birchum to be a silly woodshop teacher that people could laugh at, but has since forgotten the point. Today, Mr. Birchum is still a character to laugh at, but instead of being at the expense of the character, it's at the expense of the creator. In other words, Adam Carolla stopped being a comedian and started being a clown. Well, that's that. Now wait a second. Is it hypocritical to criticize bad animation when we're poorly animated? Aw, dang it. Not so quick, do something impressive. Oh, forget it.